I was in a packed coffee shop the other day, and the table next to me was holding court. It was a group of students, maybe 20 years old, and they were loudly deconstructing everything wrong with the world. They had it all figured out. They talked about the fundamental unsustainability of the economy, the boomer mindset that had ruined the planet, and complete lack of authenticity in media. One of them, with this look of profound, weary wisdom, said, "Our generation just sees the code. We see the flaws they were blind to. We're actually going to fix it." They were so certain, so smug. It was this perfect sealed bubble of idealism. And then their orders were called. They all stood up, grabbed their drinks in single-use paper cups, and as they walked out, not one of them glanced back at the mountain of sugar packets, used napkins and plastic stir sticks they left piled on the table for someone else to clean up. Okay, so let's unpack that. That moment, it just captures this persistent paradox, doesn't it? Every new generation believes it sees the world clearly, sees the flaws the last one missed. And yet, so many of these huge societal problems, they just seem to loop back around. So for this deep dive, we want to get into the mechanisms behind that. Is it just, youthful hubris, or is there a predictable flaw in how we pass down wisdom?
Well, what you're describing is the classic tension, right? It's
Yeah.
the gap between a high-level theoretical understanding, seeing the code, as they
Right.
put it, and the really messy day-to-day business of living ethically.
Right.
And our research suggests that this cycle of repeating mistakes, it really comes down to three big forces. First, you have these predictable generational rhythms. Second, the inevitable erosion of institutional memory.
Okay.
And third, a systemic failure in teaching the one skill that matters most: practical, contextual, ethical judgment. So we're going to explore why idealism is so often sealed off from accountability, and why societies seem almost programmed to repeat their biggest mistakes.
That feels like the perfect place to start with those big generational cycles, because you're right, it feels like this isn't random. This belief that we're the ones who finally figured it out seems to come around again and again.
It does. And there are frameworks to help us understand this. We can look at something like the Strauss-Howe generational theory.
Okay.
It posits that Western society moves in a long cycle, about 85 years, which they call a saeculum. And this cycle is driven by 4 turnings.
And a turning is what, like a season, a societal mood?
Exactly. Think of them as shifts in the cultural and political climate. And these turnings shape the generations that come of age within them. The cycle alternates between eras where institutions are strong and people value the collective.
Like a post-war era, maybe?
Precisely. They call those highs and crises.
Yeah.
But then it swings the other way to eras where individualism is dominant and institutions are attacked and torn down. Those are the awakenings and unravelings.
So a generation that grows up during an unraveling.
They're going to see institutional flaws everywhere. Distrust is their default setting. So the idea that the system is broken isn't a radical thought for them. It's just common sense.
And that connects perfectly to that coffee shop moment. The students, they see the code because they grew up in an unraveling where individualism and distrust were flourishing. They're what the theory might call the hero archetype, gearing up for a predicted crisis.
Yes, and that's why they feel this immense certainty, this sense that they are the ones who have to fix it all.
It makes sense.
But, and this is a really important but, we have to be careful here. In academic circles, this theory gets a lot of criticism.
For being what? Too neat.
Too neat, too deterministic. Some even call it a kind of pseudoscience because it tends to generalize so broadly and, downplays other huge factors like economic class, race, or gender. So it's a useful narrative framework for sure, but the evidence for it is contested.
It's a lens, not a law of physics.
Exactly.
But even if you don't buy the exact 85-year timeline, that core idea of shifting values is very real. You see it in the data. Older generations shaped by, say, war or depression, they tend to prioritize what we call materialist values.
Right, so economic stability, fighting inflation, law and order, basic security.
And then younger generations who grew up in relative prosperity.
They shift towards post-materialist values. They're more concerned with freedom of speech, self-expression, having more say in how things are run. The world they were born into just completely rewires their priorities.
So that brings us to the next big problem. It's not just that the mood shifts. The actual solutions, the institutions that one generation builds to prevent a crisis, they seem to fall apart over time. Why?
This is maybe the most sobering part of this whole discussion. It's something called the memory of generations hypothesis.
Okay.
It basically connects the length of major economic cycles, you might have heard of Kondratiev of waves, about 55 to 60 years, to the active lifespan of a single generation in the workforce.
So how does that work?
Well, the cycle starts with a huge historical catastrophe. Let's call it an event. Think the Great Depression or a world war.
A society-defining trauma.
Yes. And that trauma forces the creation of crucial institutions designed specifically to stop it from happening again. In the 1930s, for instance, you got major banking regulations put in place to safeguard the system.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the hypothesis is that the active memory of that trauma, the visceral, I lived through this memory, it weakens.
It weakens and then it disappears as that generation, the people who actually experienced it, mature and leave public life. And that window is about 55 to 60 years.
Wow.
Once that memory is gone, caution is lost. Stability is just taken for granted. And those protective institutions, they start to look like
Red tape. Unnecessary bureaucracy.
Exactly. And that's precisely the cycle we saw play out between the Great Depression and the 2008 Great Recession. Those Depression-era regulations were slowly, piece by piece, dismantled by overconfident politicians and regulators who only knew the 1930s from a history book.
It wasn't a lived, terrifying reality for them.
Not at all. So they took stability for granted, increased the risk in the system, and, well, we saw what happened, a recurrence of a deep economic crisis.
The Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset talked about something similar, right? The mass man.
He did, a chillingly accurate description. He saw this person as a byproduct of modern success, of democracy and technology, someone who inherits all the benefits of civilization without any understanding of the sacrifice it took to build it.
Like a spoiled child.
The psychology of a spoiled child, yes, who believes everything is permitted and that the world owes them something. They lose respect for the rules, for the system, and that, he argued, is how civilization degenerates back into primitivism, a society that forgets its past.
Which brings us right back to that pile of napkins at the coffee shop. The students could see the big systemic code, but they failed the simple practical test of cleaning up their own mess. So this isn't just about historical memory on a grand scale. It's about a gap in personal ethical capacity. What is that missing ingredient that connects theory to action?
The missing ingredient has a name, and it's an ancient one. It's phronesis.
Phronesis.
Or practical wisdom. It comes from Aristotelian virtue ethics. It's sort of the meta virtue. It's the conductor of the whole orchestra of other virtues.
So what does it actually do?
It tells you how to use the rules. I mean, think about it. Ethical training usually gives you principle A, say patient autonomy, and principle B, maybe maximizing the social good.
Okay.
But real life is messy. Real life is when principle A and principle B are in direct conflict. Phronesis is the skill of knowing in that specific, unique moment which rule to bend, which to prioritize. It's not about knowing the code. It's about knowing how to apply it in the real world.
So the students failing to clean their table isn't a failure to understand sustainability as a concept. It's a failure of phronesis in the moment.
Precisely. They have the abstract ideal, but not the practical wisdom to translate it into accountable behavior minute by minute.
And you're saying our education systems are bad at teaching this?
They're terrible at it. Research shows training for professionals, teachers, doctors, you name it. It focuses on those big abstract principles or on tiny formal rules. They get almost no training in navigating the complex, uncodifiable dilemmas of actual practice.
So can you even teach wisdom in a classroom? Can you teach phronesis?
That is the million-dollar question. And it's incredibly difficult because real ethical dilemmas are what we'd call embodied. They aren't just intellectual puzzles.
What do you mean by embodied?
They involve stress, powerful emotions, physical sensations. You can't fully simulate the gut-wrenching feeling of a high-stakes decision in a safe academic setting.
Right.
And if you try to teach these complex experiences too early, or just reduce them to a thought experiment, you risk creating what's called developmental naivety.
Which sounds like
It's the perfect recipe for the Dunning-Kruger effect. The less practical experience someone has, the more confident they are in their ability to handle it, which, sounds a lot like our students in the coffee shop.
And to make it worse, the institutions themselves can work against wisdom. If you're a professional in a system with a really rigid, top-down audit culture, you have no room to exercise that kind of judgment.
You're just following a flowchart. It effectively deprofessionalizes the role. Why bother developing wisdom if the rulebook has an answer for everything?
Okay, so this is getting more complex. What happens when the ethical frameworks themselves, the very tools we're meant to use, are seen as part of the problem? For some people, their historical experience makes it hard to even engage with these traditional ideas.
This is a critical point. If you think about populations that have experienced deep intergenerational trauma, say the legacy of apartheid in South Africa, that experience can profoundly impact the very cognitive functions you need for this kind of moral reasoning.
Like what?
Well, things like memory, trust in institutions, emotional regulation. When a community feels deeply alienated by historical injustice, they're going to struggle to adopt ethical systems that feel like they were built by their oppressors.
So a framework like utilitarianism, which is about the greater good,
Is immediately suspicious.
yeah,
Because for generations, their community suffered for the so-called greater good of another group. And virtue ethics, which relies on a stable moral character and trusting social norms, is also a hard sell when those very norms upheld an oppressive system.
the frameworks are seen as tainted, disconnected from their lived reality. So what is the pedagogical response to that? How do you teach ethics in that kind of context?
It's a huge controversy, actually. Some advocate for trauma-informed pedagogy, which prioritizes emotional safety above all else. But critics worry that risks, a dumbing down of education.
So what's the alternative?
The most promising direction seems to be a kind of hybrid model. You integrate the useful parts of Western ethical theories, the structure, the universal principles, with local or indigenous frameworks that really prioritize that socio-historical context.
Can you give an example?
A powerful one is incorporating the African ethical philosophy of Ubuntu.
I am because we are.
Exactly. It emphasizes community, empathy, collective responsibility.
Yeah.
In contexts where social cohesion and collective justice are paramount, that framework resonates so much more deeply than one focused on an isolated, abstract individual. It puts the relationship at the center of everything.
It's a way of grounding the theory in the lived reality of the community. It's phronesis on a societal scale.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
It recognizes that for ethical guidance to be meaningful, it has to be rooted in the memory and values of the people it's meant to serve. So what we've really explored today shows that this failure to learn from the past, it isn't just a simple mistake or lack of effort. It's more like a multi-layered design flaw in how we operate.
Yeah, a design flaw built into human life itself. We're cycling through these predictable generational moods. We are losing crucial institutional memory over these terrifying 55-year spans. We're struggling to teach the messy, embodied skill of practical wisdom. And for many, historical trauma creates an active resistance to the traditional ethical norms themselves. The challenge of connecting that idealistic theory to accountable, practical action isn't unique to any single generation. It's a constant, self-renewing test for all of us.